are tanker corridors that currently aren't used by tankers, right? So that's what the piece was. And the question is, well, what's the history around, isn't it better for government to do the research than relying on industry research? It's been a feature of the Canadian environmental assessment process ever since we've had environmental assessment, which we actually no longer have, but the feature of this was the proponent, which I've always thought was a conflict of interest. It's not my favorite system, but this is how it's always worked in Canada. The proponent company or department of government that wants the approval of the project pays for the research. So, you know, when I was fighting Great Whale and fighting Hydro-Quebec with the damming in northern Quebec, we were dealing with volumes of studies paid for by Hydro-Quebec. I mean, it's been the same on every project you can name. So Enbridge,
how did that get set up?
Okay, it was set up like that since, I mean, the first environmental assessment process was an order in council in 1974 that said there would be an environmental assessment research process called environmental assessment review process called the ERP. It was a guidelines order. It always included the proponent does the research. Then you go forward, we ended up getting it legislated in 1993 as the Canadian Environmental Assessment Process. As a law, the SIA process always involved the proponent does the research. The theory basically being they plan to do the project, they have the onus of proof, they should pay for the research. They have to usually bring forward, always bring forward research against a series of questions put forward by a tribunal of some kind, usually an environmental assessment panel. In the case of the National Energy Board Joint Review Project for Enbridge and the Northern Gateway Project, Enbridge was asked to provide information about what they would do about a spill, how they would clean up a spill, how the product in their pipelines would behave in a spill. And the reason that Christy Clark and her Minister of Environment, after the election, which is pretty significant, testified when they had their summation evidence to the Joint Review Panel, the government of British Columbia said, we can't approve or support this project because Enbridge has failed to provide any evidence that they know how to manage a spill of bitumen and diluent, how bitumen and diluent will behave spilled over the terrain, say where the pipelines are, or how bitumen mixed with diluent will behave in the open ocean. All the evidence that Enbridge provided was about a product they don't plan to be shipping, which is crude oil. So that's how come the British Columbia government could say, we won't approve this project. So now, if the federal government was still funding the experimental lakes area, still funding the marine contaminants program, 80 scientists across Canada who were all laid off this summer, including the lead scientist here in this riding. They've killed the Polar Environmental Arctic Research Lab in Eureka, the closest lab for ozone and climate scientists to the North Pole of any country in the world, that just 4 years ago installed $10 million worth of new equipment. For heaven's sakes, they can't even afford the $250,000 a year to keep open for school children a chance to look at the observatory at the Center for the Universe, right? They've killed the programs for oil spill research that was going on in Nova Scotia. They've killed the science program, all funding for the Canadian Foundation on Climate and Atmospheric Research, all funding killed. So if we were dealing with a time when proper science was, they've killed all the research within national parks. All the scientists in national parks across Canada have been laid off. All of the habitat DFO workers to make sure that fish habitat was protected across Canada, all laid off. So in that context, $78 million to help Enbridge is a bit much. The other context is there's a hearing process going on. And the evidence in the hearing process is the evidence before the tribunal. And now we find that since May 2012, the federal government has been planning to spend all this money to provide at least the cover, if not the science, that Enbridge will need to say it's going ahead, and to provide guidance about tanker routes for supertankers through the Hecate Strait. So what it comes down to me, is it goes back to where did it come from? In budget 2012, and I promise you I have not committed much of the budgets of the last number of years to memory, but this was significant. In 2012, the budget said federal funding of science and research will be focused on science that is, quote unquote, business-led and industry-relevant. So where the science is going to go is for things like, there's science going, federal funding is going towards, which is important, I'm not saying it's not important, monitoring how much the tailings ponds of the Athabasca oil sands are leaching into the Athabasca River. They had been ignoring that for a long time, and now they're saying we're going to have, what is it? It's gold-plated, blue ribbon. I mean, they're always world-class gold ribbon, all that stuff. That's helpful language. So where the science dollars of the government of Canada no longer go to the kind of science that the government of Canada has done for the last 100 years. It's going specifically and narrowly to projects that Stephen Harper wants approved. So that's why, and the reason that Andrew Weaver and I were so scandalized by these numbers that we got on this leaked document was that it was so much money, and also that it wasn't just research, it was operationally focused as though the project was already approved, and we wanted to be sure we could move tankers safely. So I was astonished that it didn't get more pickup in the media, that we had so many people in the media except Joe Oliver. Joe Oliver, Minister of Natural Resources, actually said, Elizabeth May should do her homework. We announced all this in March. And he referenced a press conference that I had not only watched, but that I had dissected the announcement, corrected his mistakes, and posted an article about the issues that they talked about at that press conference. Nowhere in that press conference did they say that Canada was spending $78 million this year, $42 million next year, in enabling Enbridge to do its projects. So I find it offensive. Media was prepared to accept Joe Oliver's explanation, and the Vancouver Sun ran an editorial yesterday saying that the Greens were all crazy because, after all, it's a good thing to do the research. Of course it's a good thing to do the research, but Enbridge was supposed to present evidence to the Joint Review Panel. The Joint Review Panel doesn't report to the Cabinet until December of this year, and this amount of money being spent makes it very, and also, by the way, in case I didn't mention it to you, in case you didn't see the media, this money is being spent and the documentation within the government calls it the Northern Gateway Project. So it's not sort of generic research that one would want to have. It's labeled